Well, welcome back, everybody. My guest today is the GOAT, the greatest of all time. He was the CIO of FedEx for almost a quarter of a century, which is 6 times the average tenure of a CIO. It's just unbelievable. He led his global organization to a mind-blowing 27 straight CIO 100 awards. And you all know that's the top honor for business impacting technology innovation. And while he was inducted into the CIO Hall of Fame in 2007, I assert his greatest impact came in the 17 years following that. So this, of course, could be none other than the Rob Carter that we all know and love. And I'm not going to lie to you, trying to figure out how do you unpack the story of the GOAT was both exciting and daunting. But what a gift, what a joy it's been to pull this together. So to help me with this, I want to start off with a mystery questioner, somebody who knows Rob really well. And as Rob will refer, he's the CIO's CIO. He's a true industry legend. So let's listen in.
Rob, when you and I met 25 years ago, you had first gotten the job of CIO at FedEx, and I was the CIO at Delta Airlines, and we met in New York. And the things that I remember from that meeting were you were humble, looking for advice. You were curious about everything. You were kind and you were energetic. And over the last 25 years, you and I have gotten to know each other, and I've watched you get all kinds of awards and accolades. And I got the had the honor of this June going to your retirement. And what I was just not surprised, but delighted with was that you were still the same humble, curious, kind, and energetic person as you were 25 years earlier. And it struck me as to how did you keep yourself energized through 25 years in the same company?
Wow. Who's that? Who's that, Rob?
That is my friend and mentor, Charlie Feld. I call Charlie the CIO's CIO. He is an extraordinary contributor to the art and practice of what we all do.
Yeah, incredible. Well, he's got a perspective, that's his perspective is 55 years in the industry. We did a podcast together back in July 2022. I want people to go back and check that out. But talk about his question's a good one, right? And I guess part of your success story.
Yeah, so I worked with Charlie for many of those years, so he got to see the journey. But there's no question about the fact that this is hard work that we do, and it can chew you up and spit you out if you're not careful. So I've always been a big believer in opportunities to recharge yourself, opportunities to get creativity from outside things, not just from working day in and day out to empty out the salt mine. That can take the pep out of your step. There's no question about it. And so, Charlie understood this well because he did it at so many different places. But I really chose to do the work for a long time at FedEx and loved that opportunity to work with so many great people in such a great company that's so important to the world. I was always content in that work. It wasn't something where I was having to go search. I had many opportunities to do different things, but I felt like it was my calling to be at FedEx. But the most important thing about that longevity is to take care of yourself, to make sure that you're, ready, for your team, for the business, for the customers, by having the right kind of energy, staying healthy, doing everything you can to be at your best every day.
Yeah, so good. Thank you, Charlie. And Rob, thank you again. This is so long overdue, and I'm just so excited for our conversation today. And I want to double click on humility because it is such a big part of your story. It's the common denominator of all the great leaders that we know. And I want to take us back. One of my favorite stories. I mentioned the introduction. Under your leadership, the company's won 27 straight CIO 100 awards. I mean, it's just, that will never be done again. And I remember talking, it was around number 20, and I'm like, Rob, does it ever get old? You know, do you remember your response? If you remember your response, it was incredible.
Well, I think I do. I think it was how great it is to be there with the team. So one of the things I always did, I never showed up at those things by myself. I would bring the MVPs from whatever it was that we had submitted that year for the CIO 100, and I would bring them, and they would get an opportunity to see, what it felt like to be honored for the work that you do. And so I'm always super proud of the team members and believe that, thank goodness we're talking about humility right here off the bat, because, that intro, you can't let that go to your head. You can never call yourself the GOAT, by the way. I'm going to leave that to you and the audience if that's legit or not. But, that's a moniker somebody else has to put on you. But, I really hope that this conversation gives me an opportunity to be personal about what it means to be, really talk about mentors and mistakes and all of the people along the way that made it possible, because it was so far from an individual journey that made those things happen. I didn't lay a lick of code for any of those 27 awards, but I tried to be there for the teams and I tried to lift them up. And the reason that year after year we would submit, our best project, we would vet, any number of projects in any given year and pick the one that we thought was coolest, most impactful for the business. And the reason that we do that is to lift the whole team up. When they see that kind of thing come across the wire, and we get to talk about, these projects that we do that have an impact on the business. And when the outside world looks in and sees the work, they think it's good, because sometimes when you're right there, in the battle, you're not always just hearing great feedback on everything you do. This is hard stuff, and you got to fight your way through problems. You got to fight your way, to making these projects great. And so it was always about the team. It was never about me, so I could, have some, stripes and stars on my shoulder. It was always about figuring out a way to make the team understand just how important their work is.
Yeah, they're so fun to be around. They were so energized, excited, and to be there. And the other thing that you told me in that call was, yeah. And when I got back to Memphis, someone handed me a shovel and said, get back to work. Right? Is that the culture?
I'm going to tweak that one just a little bit, because now I totally remember that. I used to say, I've got this Cinderella job, and I would start with it just like that. I've got this Cinderella job. I get to show up, at these things, and, the carriage rolls up and the red carpet, and they put a glass slipper on my foot. That's the funny part. You know, but then when I get back home, the carriage turns into a pumpkin and the scepter turns into a broom, and they say, clean this stuff up. The Cinderella part of it is a balance. Anybody that works inside of enterprise IT knows that, the glamour isn't continuous. You don't get to come back to trumpets, blaring your arrival and things like that. You get to come back and work hard and clean stuff up and fix things that are broken and make things better that the business and customers need to be better. And so that's why I always called it a Cinderella job.
I love that story. And Rod, there's that sentiment out there about people quit bosses, not jobs, right? And you talked earlier about mentors, and you work for one of my iconic entrepreneurial American superheroes, Fred Smith, and you work closely together. I'd love to have you talk about him and how integral is he for you to be at FedEx so long? How did he influence your leadership thinking and how you show up at boards and doing your board work and all that?
Well, it's almost hard to put it into words, Dan. I mean, Fred is a unique individual, so many great qualities. I mean, he is customer obsessed. He knows how to grow a business. He's operationally incredibly astute and effective. He is strategic. He has the ability to lay out vision. He is financially, incredibly strong with his acumen. And so many times it's, when you look at a CEO, you can pick out their dominant gene. Of all those things I just mentioned, with Fred, that was impossible. He would change from, one of those things to the next in the moment and incredibly appropriately. And to have a seat at the table for those many, many years. I worked directly for Fred for 22 years. In 2022, he stepped out of the CEO role and as executive chairman at FedEx. So I still was working for him, but in a little bit of a different relationship there. But, Fred was an incredible systems architect and maybe better way to say it is an information architect. In the early days of the company, he and Jim Barksdale were the ones that envisioned the tracking systems. That was something that didn't exist. Today, we'd all call that table stakes. You don't ship things without knowing where they are and how they're being handled. But in that day, there was no such thing. Transportation systems were black holes. Things went in at one point and popped out at the other end when you were lucky enough to get them. And he believed, way back in the 70s. And at that point in time, they were soldering together, handheld computers, contact scanners that could read a barcode. They bought up 800 megahertz spectrum coast to coast to put radio towers out there, not so they could talk to the couriers out in the vehicles, but so that they could move data back and forth from the point of interaction at the edge back into the core systems to enable those things. Those kinds of things just blow my mind, that they literally dreamed those things up. It's kind of a feather that Charlie has in his cap, too, putting the handhelds out there at Frito-Lay back in the day. Those were the two companies that were doing that incredible work. So, I could go on and on about Fred's stories and what a joy it was to work with Fred. Was he challenging? You better believe it. Would he occasionally, plant a boot in your rear, if things didn't go right? You bet. He was a 2 combat tour duty Marine in Vietnam, Yale economist, but, enlisted after that to serve his country. A patriot of the highest order, and just someone that commands respect wherever he goes. What a delight it is to work at a company where the founder and CEO steps out in front of a group of employees, and the 100% natural, automatic, and genuine responses, they all leap to their feet and give him a standing ovation. Who wouldn't want that job, to support someone like that?
I think of Fred, just one of the things that I think is so unique about him is his ability to grow with the company over 50 years, right? From zero, from a thought to 90 billion. And I put Michael Dell in that category too. Michael, from his dorm room, 40 years later, still going strong at Dell. Just incredible. But what is it about those two that we can all learn from? Because
Well,
Michael as well, I'm sure.
I do. I know Michael fairly well, and worked with Michael for a long time. In fact, I had a friend that came back from an EBC briefing at Dell one time and said, in fact, he was an ex FedEx colleague. He worked for me at FedEx, and Michael walked into the room and said, "Hey, I see that you worked with Rob Carter at FedEx for a while." And my colleague said, "Yeah, I did." And I said, and Michael said, and there were several witnesses to this. He goes, Rob and I weren't high school buddies, but sometimes it feels like it because I've known him so damn long, But I was honored that he would say that to one of our colleagues. But with those two, they both started their companies fairly young. Fred had to go raise an incredible amount of money for a venture capital firm at the time when he started, when he was 28. Unheard of amount of money to go buy 25 airplanes and set up a facility and start moving things. And, it was for an idea that most people thought was absolutely ludicrous. But what I would say about both individuals, and they're both so evolved from where they were, and I mean, I say that with the greatest respect for them. They were both, let's face it, they're both kind of young and brash and, very, very smart and capable. But they went through what I call the learn and adapt cycle. Learn, adapt, learn, adapt, learn, adapt. They were never hunkered down in their belief. I remember talking to Michael right as the EMC acquisition was going through and what really made, today what we know as Dell Technologies. And he was so curious to talk to me as a customer of both entities and compare, what one did better than the other and how that worked. We had an hour-long conversation. He called out of the blue to pick my brain about EMC as that was coming together. And so curiosity is a really, important part of what they both do. They're perpetual learners. They adapt and learn and adapt and learn.
Well, they have inspired many, they've led many, and they've gone against all the odds and still going strong 50 and 40 years later. Speaking of inspirational, I want to talk a little bit more about mentors and mentoring, but I want to do it through the lens of one of our special questioners. So listen into this next question and see if you recognize this person.
Rob, I know throughout your career at FedEx, you mentored employees at all levels, and regardless of your busy schedule, you never hesitated to meet with anyone at their request. I believe this to be a true calling of yours. Can you share with us the impact that you think it made on their lives and what it meant to you as well?
Well, Dan, that is delightful because that is my assistant, Rachel Harvey, my executive assistant. And Rachel and I worked together for 30 years. She started supporting me when I first became a VP at FedEx, and we retired together at the end of those 30 years this summer. We're about a week apart in age, so we both learned and grew together. But Rachel is a special person, and I could not have had the success that I had without Rachel keeping me between the guardrails and keeping me focused because I'm a bit of an absent-minded professor at times for sure, and she is detail-oriented and focused and keep me moving. So thank you, Rachel, for that question. Look, I have a mantra, and I think it's going to weave its way through this entire story as we tell it. But my mantra is work hard, lead a balanced life, and have an undying respect for people. And I emphasize that last part of it because, working hard is the name of the game. We've got to work hard, but you can't work hard and not lead a balanced life, or as we said, that will take its toll on you. But always remember, it's a people business and have an undying respect for people. So when people had the what they felt was important enough, and many individual contributors over the years would ping our office and say, I'd love to sit down and talk to Rob. And as Rachel said, we never turned one of them down. Sometimes it took some time to get his busy schedules and all that, but we never turned anyone down. And so that really falls into that category of having undying respect for people. And I'm not talking about having an undying respect for people in authority positions. And, I'm talking about people. Whether it's the security guards or the people that worked, in our deli or the people that cleaned the offices around us, I took the time to learn their name, show respect for them. And I just believe it's one of those things, I'm not better than they are. I don't, my time's, not something that should be, isolated from the world and from what people are doing. So, that's personal to me. And, I said I wanted to, kind of make this personal, but it really is part of that philosophy. You've got to have an undying respect for people because if you just roll over people, it's never going to end well, in my opinion. And so I have the privilege of saying I hope and believe that at least this part of the journey of my life and this career did end well because I always showed respect for people. And, I get texts and emails continuously. I got one last night from a colleague who just gotten a promotion. And, their whole, emphasis was thanking me for the influence and time that I had given to them and coached them along the way. It's an important promotion, but I've watched this individual grow. And, and I celebrate diversity that way. I celebrate people of all walks of life. So I loved Rachel's question. That was really, really great. And I hope, all I can do is hope and to some degree believe that, that as I've walked this walk, that it's had a positive influence on the people around me.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Rachel. She owns your calendar, so she knows where you spent your time and where you prioritized. And just appreciate her so much, and just your story together. Rob, I think about, obviously you've had great mentors in your journey, and you're big on self-awareness. You're pretty honest and direct with people, and you want that in return. But is there a mentor or two that really stands out to you that had a big impact on you?
Yeah, obviously we've already talked about Fred, so I'll let that one stand. But there are some incredible mentors, and there's going to be a pattern here that you'll see. So I want to start with a guy that almost no one knows, who knows me well, but has been so influential to me. It's a guy named John DeFore. John just turned, to put this in context, John just turned 105 this summer. I met John when he was about 85. So I've known John for about 20 years, and he's been so influential in my life. Just an extraordinary guy. He's actually a psychologist, counselor, and author. But I met him through a friend who's another mentor at a time when I needed somebody like John to help me. I mean, so never be too proud to recognize when you need help. And so I met John. John's got a lot of books out there. If people search those, my favorite one is Secrets of My Heart. And it really gives you a perspective of John's life and, being an infantryman in the Pacific. John's about, he's kind of unusual, because a lot of times tall guys don't live. So, I mean, most people don't live to 105, but John's about 6'6", a tall guy. And, but he was an infantryman, and he talks about being in the South Pacific in, muddy, torrent drenched foxholes, and I mean, and these were things he could never talk about. Secrets of My Heart was always about that. So I can't drain the swamp on, on all of these mentors, because they're all so impactful. But one of the things you're going to see emerge as I go through a couple of these folks is wisdom. Today we have this sort of existential belief that everything new is good and everything new is, we rush headlong towards it and we forget about wisdom. And a lot of these folks are, just legendary. Charlie, is next on the list. Charlie, I believe, is 82 now. Talk about energetic and humble, and, Charlie just is amazing. There's a guy named Larry Sen, who was one of the founders of Sen Delaney, cultural genius. In fact, when he was doing his PhD at UCLA, he is widely credited as the guy that that coined the term corporate culture. It used to be, in the 70s, it was just work. You went to work and people, but Larry is a genius when it comes to corporate culture. A friend of mine, he did a triathlon as he was turning 80, wrote a book called The Octogenarian Triathlete. And Larry, if you talk to Larry today, you would hear the youth in his voice at, what is this? I think he's 85-ish right now, as far as I'm concerned. Jim Barksdale, I never got to work directly with Jim Barksdale here at FedEx. He was the first CIO at the company, but he later joined our board and was the chairman of our board committee called the Cyber and Technology Oversight Committee. And I learned so much from Jim. Jim Barksdale is unique. Jim's 82, 83 now as well. And then I definitely want to point out Brad Martin. Brad Martin's a unique individual who, helped me so much on my journey. He was the guy that brought me into sort of public company board service. He was the CEO of Saks Corporation. But Brad's just a unique individual, someone who will always take the time to hear you, to listen to you. He's the guy that introduced me to John DeFore, that first guy I talked about. So I know that's a big list, and I'm still leaving out some really important people. Jim Lair, who founded the Human Performance Institute down in Orlando, incredible guy, another psychologist, who really helps you get your head right, as well as preparing yourself mentally, physically, and spiritually for the job. He wrote the book The Corporate Athlete, and Jim became a good friend of mine as well. So rife. My journey is rife with excellent mentors and people who cared about me and would take the time to help me and help me grow. I hope it was because some of what Charlie said was true, that I would show up curious and humble, not in any way arrogant or prideful, but I need to learn, I need to grow, I need some help. And that's an important part about having a learning mindset.
Yeah, I think, and I'm sure they would say the same, Robin. This mentorship relationship, people forget it's two-way, right? And as you're mentoring people, you got value from that. As they were mentoring with you, I'm sure they got a lot from that too. And I love the fact that there's two psychologists in there. That really speaks to your interest in getting outside of our space, right? And although you and I would probably argue that our space is, well, you've already said it, our space really is people. And
Totally.
yeah, I've got another great mystery question who's known you a long time, a couple decades or better, and I think it's going to help us shine the light on, again, more of your leadership abilities, the superpowers. So listen in on this one.
Hi, Rob. With a legendary CIO career that has spanned well over 2 decades, you've certainly seen a lot. When you think about what it takes to be a successful technology executive, what has changed versus what has stayed the same, and how has that pace of change accelerated?
Well, that's clearly my great friend and colleague, Ken Spangler. Ken served as my right-hand person here at FedEx for so many years. Ken's an engineer's engineer, just an exceptional leader in his own right. And I was always so proud that Ken was willing to, Ken is another one of those guys who had so many opportunities. He recently retired from FedEx as well. But, there's no question about the fact that the pace of technological change is a challenge for us. I mean, when I think about my journey, I graduated as an undergraduate from the University of Florida with a computer science degree in 1981. And so that just also kind of happens to be, right at the advent of the personal computer. There were things like Commodore 64s and stuff like that, but the IBM PC came out in 81, 82. And, that was a wave of change. Many people believed, well, what could possibly be useful about that? It was the era of mainframes and big mini computers, and this idea that compute was personal and that all of that belonged in a space. But then you think about the next generation of fourth generation languages made a huge surge in the 80s. And so people began to do a lot more self-service, not just with the PC, but with things like SAS and Focus and other technologies that empowered the person who was out there in the midst of the business. And then came, the era of Windows computing and more sophistication at the client, and and thus the birth of client server technology, where those two things were beginning to come together. Some of the work going on at the edge, some of it going on back in the core compute. And, of course, then comes the internet, and then comes cloud and SaaS. And, one of my favorite books was Alvin Toffler's book, Future Shock. Alvin was a sociologist that wrote Future Shock back in the 1970s. And it's so prescient because it basically says, the rate of technological change is going to outstrip society's ability to handle it properly, that the folkways and the mores and the constructs of society for polite behavior and what people consider acceptable and not acceptable is going to be massively challenged by the pace and acceleration of technological change. Well, how true is that? I was watching the news last night and they were talking about how in the world are they going to deal with cell phones in schools? Do you let kids have them? Do you take, so many things. I mean, you hear about horrific things, like in a movie theater, somebody gets shot because they won't put their cell phone away. Those are, that's a harsh example. Sorry for, making it so harsh, but that's what Toffler meant, was that we would have this, these boundaries that wouldn't move as fast as the technology moves. So Fred wrote something very early. Fred Smith wrote something very early in the company called the Manager's Guide. And the opening page of the Manager's Guide is a quote by Marcus Aurelius that says, "The only constant is change." I mean, it is, get ready to get ready, get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And so that's the era that we live in right now. But there are still a lot of things that are true. When I mentioned my mentors, wisdom was, a consistent thing. And wisdom doesn't just drop on you when you're 24 because you're a great coder or you invent, a cool technology that takes the world by storm. Wisdom takes time to develop. And so, the word existential is, often misunderstood, but when it comes to sociology, it means nothing about the past is valuable, we didn't learn anything there. Everything of value happens in the moment. And what we know now, we're so evolved now that we can kind of forget about what happened in the past. Well, that is a recipe for disaster, including in technology. You have to look at the patterns of adoption. You have to look at how technologies, get inducted into our lives and into our world. And, for me, it's fascinating to describe those things. But if you talk to Charlie Feld, he gets to start all the way back in the late 60s, being a systems programmer at IBM and seeing this evolution of compute and technology. I mean, the one thing that we know for sure is it's not done yet. People are always predicting the future about what's going to happen with technology. And the one thing that I say about that is I have no idea. I if you'd asked me, how, the iPad's what now, 14 years old, maybe, but it was even more interesting when it was only a decade old and people couldn't imagine life without an iPhone and an iPad. And, the iPhone had one of my favorite things that somebody showed one time was a Radio Shack ad, a full page Radio Shack ad and an iPhone side by side. And every single thing on the Radio Shack, ad, the camcorder, the clock radio, all everything on there, the weather device, all that stuff was all, right there in that phone. And nobody could have predicted that. So technology is moving fast, but lean into some wisdom, lean into, I worry about our profession right now that, that there's a lot of belief that everything, that's happened thus far in technology is useless. And, the only thing that's valuable is what's coming at us in, cloud. And that's not true. It's still compute at the end of the day. There's still a need for transactional compute and systems of engagement and systems of record. And, yes, systems of insight are incredibly important, but they have to work hand in hand.
Yeah, that's interesting. Great wisdom all around. And I think back to the story you told about the evolution of our profession. And we called it at that time end user computing, back to compute, right? And most people, those are the days of data processing, right? It was basically end, user computing. we don't want that to happen, right? Keep it locked up. But no, that's brilliant. Yeah. I know you're really proud of Ken and what he did at FedEx, but also his next chapter. We just did a podcast together with he and Steve.
Great.
But would you talk about, when you talk about Q cubed, what does that mean in Rob Carter speak?
Yeah, this is a relatively new construct for me. It's something that I, popped into my head at one point, really sort of towards the end of my tenure at FedEx. And so what occurred to me was that, we all learned early on about IQ. And it's important to be smart. It is, without a doubt, people in our industry are smart. Some of the smartest people I know are practitioners of what we do. But we also then, as time marched on, and especially as culture became such an important part of it, we started talking about EQ, your emotional quotient. How relatable are you? How well do you work with people? How well can you put together a story or context or communicate effectively in ways that, and show empathy. Empathy is one of the most important characteristics of the human condition, is the ability to feel what it's like to wake up behind someone else's eyes, and have compassion about the things that people go through. And so we spent quite a bit of time on IQ and EQ. But then there was this third Q that arrived. A couple of friends of mine started talking about it. Todd Martin at Unboundary was one of the first people that I saw talk about it. And he talked about adaptability. And so the third Q is the AQ, the adaptability quotient. And remember, as we talked about Toffler and we talked about these waves of technology and we talked about how people react to them, both positively and negatively, a lot of that has to do with your AQ. How adaptable are you to morphing and changing? When we talked about Michael Dell and Fred Smith, we talked about learn, adapt, learn, adapt, learn, adapt, the learn, adapt cycle. And, the great leaders that I know are all adaptive. They all, you mentioned Fred and, kind of from this crazy startup, as a young man recently retired from the military, to this behemoth that connects the world today. Trust me, that required a great deal of adaptation along the way. You had to get rid of stuff that had once made the company work and made it great. And you had to move on to new concepts, open up a wider aperture for what the world would need. And, so Q cubed was the moniker I tagged to it now, and saying that the complete leader is someone who's got good IQ and good EQ and excellent AQ these days, because the world is changing fast and you have to adapt fairly quickly. You don't forget the past, but you don't just clutch at it either, because that would be a problem.
We could spend a lot of time on that one topic, Rox. I think that's going to be the differentiator. And Ken says the same thing for leaders, for teams, for entire companies. And so, but I want to move on because we've got more great questions. In fact, I've got one coming up who I think this person was very integral to your journey, and I know you were to hers as well. And so I want to listen into the rich context and then her question. So let's check this out.
So, about 25 years ago, you became the CIO at FedEx. At the time, we were a global corporation, about $18 billion in revenue each year, with big plans for growth all around the world. We also had the extra demand on the IT group to finish out the requirements for Y2K compliance. And we were also facing disparate IT organizations through the various acquisitions that we had. With all the demands on the IT organization from the business and in general, just the things that IT had to take care of, you had this epiphany that the technology that had served FedEx so very well for the first 25 years was not going to carry us forward. You recognized clearly that we needed to update our architecture and technology, our methodologies, the org structure, and the talent base Talk about the challenges that you faced to explain to the business what I would call the technology transformation of a career, and how you kept the IT team focused on this goal, this transformation, and balanced with the business demands that moved FedEx from an $18 billion corporation to a $90 billion corporation.
Well, that is my long-term chief of staff, Miss Dottie Berry. Dottie, I keep talking. Dan, you went and found the people who are most influential to me in this journey at FedEx with Ken and Dottie and Rachel, people who were with me for very long periods of time, who, endured the test of time with us. But, Dottie's question is so important. And when you think about, when we had crossed over 2000, I became CIO in 2000. We just finished Y2K, and maybe we're a little distracted by that. But it became apparent in the aftermath of that what got us here wasn't going to get us there. We had acquired several large companies. We had collected, in my words, technologies from across those decades from 1972 to 2000. And it was absolutely critical that we begin to move that technology towards a more common pattern and dominant design. We couldn't just let technical debt, weigh the company back. We couldn't let disparate processes that lived inside of different cultures of spread out IT organizations around the world and around, those operating companies, as we've always called them. And so she mentioned all of the big things. We had to have a consistent architecture. We had to have consistent methodologies. We had to change the organizational structure in ways that would better serve the company. And trust me, every one of those was a heavy lift. I had a seat at the table, but I was looking at CEOs of operating companies that no more wanted to give me the reins to their technology and their business than the man on the moon. And so we had to, it was something that I discovered pretty early in that process, and it was something that I called ugly pictures. And so what I did was I started putting together real views of what it was we had. The first thing we had to do was say, well, what is it that we've got here? What do we have our arms around with regard to the technology estate? So we inventoried it all and we drew it all up, and at the end of the day, it looked like Katrina. This rational rose diagram that we did looked like Katrina storming onto the coast down in New Orleans. And in fact, from that day forward, Fred called it Hurricane Rob. And and I made a compelling argument saying, look, if we think that there are going to be synergies across this business, synergies with technology, synergies with the way we work, then we're going to have to do some heavy lifting. We're going to have to modernize. We're going to have to, clean out the museum, or fill up the museum, move some of this stuff off to the museum and out of production. And so we did a lot of work across a couple of decades, because one of the things, to answer Ken's question is that, for those first 30 or 40 years of enterprise compute, there was no such thing as a dominant design. I mean, you had, IBM and DECFax and Unisys and, Sperry and, and everybody, everything was proprietary. All networks were proprietary. All storage was proprietary. There was no such thing as a common binary that would run, and then all of a sudden onto the scene storms, this kind of common architecture of scaled out, I'll call it x86 because that's still a pretty predominant part of it. You could, set AI a little bit aside there, but it became clear that, like all things in engineering and then, You have to forgive me for telling this story, but I can make it quick. But we look at dominant design today like it was always that way. The plug in the wall where we plug in, our stuff. Well, it wasn't always that way. I mean, it's not like one plug emerged from the innovation of electrical distribution. There were 100 different plugs in 100 ways. And so when you look back on dominant design, call it, 110 AC, it seems like it was always that way. Well, it wasn't. The same thing with the railroad. When when the rails were first spread around this country and around the world, they were proprietary, individual. Today, 4 foot 8.25 inches on center. Those rails that are out there, all of them, in the U.S. Well, the rest of the world doesn't necessarily have that, and there are railheads where you got to offload and reload. But that was something that Lincoln did in the Pacific Railway Act of 1864, and so and what that allowed was that allowed the industrial might. It allowed the Intercontinental Railroad. It allowed the industrial might of the U.S. to power the U.S. to be the global power that it is today. That one thing, because when World War II broke out, for example, we had to use the industrial might of the U.S. to feed an Atlantic and a Pacific theater. And those rails were working every factory in the country to be able to, to create the kind of capabilities that were necessary for us to win the war. So, I'm waxing way into, but compute is no different. Compute has a dominant design pattern. And so it was really important for me to go after the businesses pretty aggressively and say, look, what do you think the probability is today that a startup company that would come and challenge us or any other company would go out and build a data center and put mainframes in it? What do you think the probability of that is? And everybody kind of says, well, 0, bingo, 0. So what does that mean? That means if you clutch at that design for your company, then you are clutching at the narrow gauge railroad that's going to turn your town into a ghost town because the rail is going to bypass you. And so it's really important for us to think about dominant design technology. And I got to that through dirty pictures and through stories like that made people believe that it was a fight worth fighting. And it was a fight that went on for a long time. I mean, we literally just right before I retired, rolled the last mainframe off of the floors. We are almost completely out of FedEx owned and operated data centers. 2 left now, and both of them shrinking rapidly as we move things into hybrid cloud environments right now. So, you could tell I kind of get passionate about it. It's not easy to get the business to spend money on anything other than feature and function. But you've got to spend money on engineering. You've got to spend money on cleanup. You've got to spend money on evolution and modernization towards those dominant design patterns that will allow you to compete in the future world.
Yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time to share that, Rob. I hadn't heard that before, and you just think of all the companies that didn't follow dominant, like a lot of companies in our technology world, right? That didn't follow that and are no longer around. So point well taken. And again, thank you to Dottie for the question, the context, and so special.
By the way, Dottie was my chief of staff for almost all the, from the time I announced the initiative in 2003, which she was really talking about. That was when I made her my chief of staff. And she also just retired with me. You can see a pattern here. We were a team. We went after this together. It's now someone else's turn, to manage it going forward for the second 50 years of our company. But we're as a team, we were really proud of the work we did to prepare the company and to hand off something that still is going to have to change continuously, but something that had evolved a long ways.
Yeah, so good. I want to get into more stories because there's so much richness in your stories. And I like to reference my son, Kelly, who's been probably our #1 fan. Like since day one of this podcast, he's been a great mentor to me. And, because that generation, they just listen to podcasts all the time. And he's also a University of South Florida MBA grad, along with you, maybe a couple of years after you, Rob, but he's also a grad. But one of his great expressions is everyone has a story. And, one of the mind-blowing stories of yours to me is you going to FedEx. That might not have happened. Like, can you share that? Like, I think it's just so rich in terms of how people should think about answering the call and evaluating opportunities.
It's funny. We all get career advice over time, and I'm gonna kind of couch it inside of career advice. Some that I followed, and some that I decided probably wasn't the right thing for me. But that journey started. I was a young programmer. I was kind of a lead on a team at what would in telecommunications company, which is where I started my career. I had graduated from the University of Florida and was plying my trade there and was doing well. But I had a VP, who wasn't my direct boss, but he was my boss's boss or something like that, who believed I had some potential and put me into a program called, continuity planning. And so the continuity was, how to give your career continuity. And so he had sponsored me for a job at what was our, that big company's shared services entity where all the big technology work was going. I was kind of working out on edge technology, learned a lot and loved the work. But Frank Zackrell, nominated me for this position, very large billing system in telecommunications, right when what was called the consent decree came out. And, the Bell system was being broken up and, put into these, and there were long distance carriers emerging like Sprint and MCI and AT&T and others. And so we were building billing systems to adapt to those changing laws and circumstances. Well, I went and interviewed for this job. I had friends at that point in time that told me, don't even think about going to work on that project. It's going to get canned. It is a mess. It's a problem. And so I went and interviewed politely. The next day they offered me the job and I politely turned them down. And Frank called me up. I still remember the 40th floor in Tampa, building that I still saw today as we're watching those storms have come through there and things like that. But I go up to the 40th floor and, I'm pretty sure that Frank is going to tell me, you made a good choice here. I'm glad you decided to stay with me because this was his organization. And instead of that, Frank basically went up one side of me and down the other, and told me that, and I quote, I have overestimated you. You are clearly just happy in your little comfort zone and you're not ready to go learn. You're not ready to go, do something different. And, if I was you, I would call them back as quickly as I could and accept the job and go. And then he proceeded to plant his boot in my butt and threw me back down to the 11th floor or wherever I worked in the salt mines there. And so my head was spinning because, Frank was like one of my, he was the guy, and so I did. I called him back and I went over and almost everything that I learned early in my career about scale development and organizational excellence and how to put together structure for teams. And so I went over there as a first line manager. And the next couple of years, I got promoted twice. I got promoted to senior manager and then director. I was still in my 20s and I was a director. I had 400 people working on this billing project. And Dan, it defined my career. I mean, it was the catapult. And without Frank, it wouldn't have happened. But then what happened next is, is part of the, still part of the FedEx story is I got an opportunity. That shared service company, as I mentioned, we were kind of coming through the era of client server computing. So there was a bunch of client server work they were doing in their call centers and dispatch and all these different things that were going on. And they gave all of that to me. So, the billing project had been delivered, unlike what my friends had said, wouldn't happen. And it was very hard, by the way, really, really hard. But I went over and had all what they called advanced development at that time, all the client server stuff, all of that. and it was cool. I mean, I was having a fun time. I mean, I was, I wasn't working on mainframes, for the first time in my career. This was all server and client stuff, really, really awesome. But this guy, this headhunter guy, figured out how to get into our voicemail system. My assistant, at the time, I'd told her, I said, I don't want to talk to headhunters, just to take a message but he had figured out how to get in my voicemail system, and he was just kind of pounding away inside the voicemail system saying, I know you're in Dallas all the time. You've got to come, talk to me, just have dinner with me. And so I had just finished my MBA at the University of South Florida. We had studied FedEx and American Hospital Supply and Sabre, travel, the kind of the companies that were turning their systems inside out and letting customers in. And as it turned out, this guy, I still remember his name, Rocky Johnson from A.T. Kearney, was hunting for FedEx. And so he said, look, you owe it to yourself to go talk to these folks. And so I did. I just, at the time, I remembered Frank's advice. I remember saying, don't be, contentment is one thing, but complacency is another thing, and don't confuse those words. This is me talking to myself. And so I said, I don't want to be complacent here. I'll go talk to them. How cool is FedEx? And so they end up offering me a job in Colorado Springs to do all the tracking systems and, dispatch and the handhelds. I mean, I had the coolest stuff as a director. I was lateraling into FedEx at the time. Well, I had another one of those calls to, come to the mountain, and it was the guy that ran telephone operations for. It wasn't even the IT guy. It was the, and he proceeded to tell me, that I was making a big mistake. That obviously that they had invested a lot in me, that my career, path was bright and my future was bright, and all of that. This was a company at the time that was just becoming Verizon, and that I should stay. I should, tell him, I'd already handed in my notice at that point in time. I said, I just have to do this. I really have to go, if I stay here, I have to admit that I'm just a lifer here. This is an opportunity for me to spread my wings and do something different, live in a different place. I'd lived in Tampa for a long time at that point in time. And so I did that. And, and it was an incredible journey at FedEx. I mean, I only stayed a director for 6 months at FedEx and got the opportunity to become a vice president. And then I became the CTO, and and then ultimately the CIO for the corporation. And so the journey was. I mean, I do look to the heavens and thank God for wisdom and counsel and just opportunities that, that had given me, an opportunity like that to find myself at FedEx in my dream job. One of the things I didn't say about working for Fred was it was literally one of those times where I used to pinch myself and say, how did this happen to me? Never imagined myself in my wildest dreams having these kind of opportunities to do such fun and interesting and exciting work.
I love that story. And, there's a little side note I'd love to have you reference. The guy who told you that you were making a big mistake leaving your former company, it just kind of speaks to never burning a bridge, right? Because he showed up again in the future, didn't he?
He sure did. Well, I'm gonna get there slightly circuitously, because it was the second person that told me I was making a mistake when it came to my career. I had graduated from high school a little early and was working at an Albertsons, everybody kind of knows Albertsons. I was working at night throwing stocks, one of the hardest jobs I ever had. But it came time for me to leave for the University of Florida. I'd been accepted. So I hand my notice in. I'd been there about 6 months or so. And I got called up to the manager's office on the mezzanine, the GM of the store, and he was sort of, he wasn't sort of, he was the guy. He was the highest guy we knew in the company. And he told me I was making a big mistake. He goes, Rob, you're making a big mistake. There's a future for you in the grocery business. And, this, you can go spend 4 years and all that money and time in college. And, we've got, and I'm not, and in no way am I making fun of the grocery store business. Obviously it's an intense business. But I just knew that that wasn't the advice, so I went that. But the same thing happened, obviously at a different time in my life where, the big guy said, you're making a mistake here. Well, years later, I joined one of my boards, the board of New York Life. And New York Life's a great company, 185-year-old company now. Really, incredible data company, tons of data. It's fascinating, by the way, to go through a pandemic with a company that had all the data from 1918 and all the data from wars and pestilence across time. Just really, really interesting. So I love New York Life. Well, this gentleman who gave me that advice happened to be the lead director when I joined the board at that company. And so as part of my interview process to join the board, here he sits, um, and it was nothing like an "I told you so" story, but I reminded him that at one point I had actually worked for him, and that we knew each other, and told him, I said, yeah, last time I talked to you, I was just on my way, headed to FedEx, which is where I still was, and he looked at me and goes, "That was you?"
I love that.
It felt a little bit like "I told you so," but it really happened.
Well, we could spend an entire podcast just talking about your board service, going back 20 years, but I want to continue on with your personal leadership journey and how you've been able to be the GOAT, to be in this game for so long, so strong. It's a sprint and it's a marathon. So I've got a couple of mystery questioners that I think will help us really unpack this on a different angle. So let's listen into this next one.
How important is it to have the right personal and professional priorities in order to be an effective leader?
Well, that's my long-term business partner and accountability partner who I had lunch with yesterday, as a matter of fact. Mike Glenn. Mike was, Mike was the brand and commercial, partner. We ran the shared services company at FedEx together for 20 years. Mike retired a few years before I did. But Mike and I both, so much of our journey was based on trust. So here's the guy that runs marketing and sales and commercial. I'm the technology and customer service guy, and we've got a journey ahead of us at FedEx to bring these companies together and do this work. And the bond that we always had was that our personal and professional priorities aligned. Mike and I both used to say regularly in town halls and everywhere else that that our priorities were faith, family, and FedEx in that order. And to navigate decades of this work, you have to have something other than just the satisfaction of your work to make you tick. And so for both of us, life was a faith journey. Mike, unbelievable guy. We spent a lot of time at lunch yesterday. He's got a special needs daughter who, really just, one of those situations where when you look at it from the outside, you just can't imagine what it's like. She's 36 years old these days, and it's just been an unbelievable journey for them. And so I could tell when Mike walked through the door in the morning into our staff meetings and things like that, I could tell how it had gone that morning. And because some mornings were great, some mornings not great at all. And so you watch someone, and it's kind of like what your son said. Everybody has a story. The story is what bringing your whole self to work is different than bringing that little slice of you to work that is your professional self. And so whether it was what Rachel talked about, having people, sometimes those people, when they showed up in my office for those one-on-ones, they just had a personal challenge they were dealing with. It wasn't a work challenge. But it's so important. And, I know exactly why Mike asked the question, because he knows the answer, is that our faith, that our families and and it didn't mean that somehow we were, subjugating FedEx. I mean, the reality is the only way that FedEx would work well is if we had those things in balance, if we had those things in check. If all we did was burn our nose on that grindstone of FedEx, we would not have been nearly the effective leaders that we were. And and interestingly enough, I mean, now that I'm retired as well, but across all of that arc of time after Mike left and still today, the reason we had lunch is because we're still accountability partners. We still share, we still get together on a regular basis, and it's important to have that kind of relationship in your life, that kind of trusted relationship. And when you can span all of those dimensions at work and tie it together as leaders, then it's really powerful.
I love it. And the fact you just had lunch yesterday is just hilarious. He didn't give up. He didn't give it up,
He
did
did.
he?
No, and I may have even mentioned, I had this big podcast coming, coming. So
That's
he did not
incredible.
mention it. No, not at all. He didn't even blink. In fact, one of the things about Mike that you could always count on was he was not the guy that had loose lips, that would sink the ship. He was, if you told him something and told him that it was, and it was something that Fred admired about both of us, was that he knew he could trust us. He could tell us things and we weren't going to go blab, even if it was juicy stuff, I mean, big, Mike and Rob were definitely people that Fred could trust to share things with, and that we would not go, hey, guess what Fred told me, kind of thing. And that just didn't happen.
Well, thank you, Mike. And thanks to Ken Spangler, who, when I was bouncing around with this, he's like, you need to get Mike. He said this was the dynamic duo, the business partnership that everyone admired, Rob, and Mike. And Ken went on to say, Mike is one of the most brilliant brand people ever to be in corporate, right? I mean, he did some magic there.
Well, he's the one. I mean, he did so many things, but one of the things, a couple of things he was known for was, changing the company's brand from Federal Express to FedEx. That's the legitimate brand of the company these days isn't Federal Express anymore; it's FedEx. And and the reality is, around the world, you learn things about your brand. We started as a domestic company. Federal Express was fine, but when you go into Latin America or different parts of the world, Federal and Federale, and it doesn't have that great of a connotation to it. And then the iconic FedEx branding with the arrow embedded in it and stuff like that. That was Mike's genius. So truly one of the great brand and commercial and customer executives ever.
You mentioned, I want to just have people just be thinking about faith, family, FedEx. And as we listen to this next mystery question, because I think he's going to actually put an exclamation point on this. So let's listen in and I want you to tell me who this is and how special he is to you as well.
It's often said that nice guys finish last. Talk to us about your faith and what role it played in your longevity and leadership style as CIO.
Well, that is none other than the inimitable Chris Winton. So I almost have to tell Chris's story to introduce him, and then I will talk a little bit deeper about faith. But Chris grew up in North Memphis, African American kid, went to the University of Memphis and came to work for us as an intern in IT right out of college, and he progressed significantly. Chris and I developed a friendship and what I claimed to be a mentor. What he claimed was a mentoring relationship, but trust me, and it'll become clear over time that I've learned more from Chris than he ever learned from me. But when he was a director, he was running our global command center for us, which was important work. Everything that went bump in the night, everything, Chris was the director of the command center. But he comes and sits down in my office and he goes, Rob, I think I need to move to HR. He said, I think my calling, and calling is a really important and powerful word in my lexicon. But he says, I think my calling is HR. Chris, very charismatic guy. He was one of our cultural leaders across the organization, and not just in IT, across Mike's and my organization at that point in time. And I said, Chris, one thing you can never expect from me is for me to stand in the way of something that anyone says is their calling. If that's your calling, you have my unmitigated support. And so Chris went to HR fairly quick. It moved laterally as a director, fairly quickly became an officer and then a senior officer, and then the CHRO, the head of HR for FedEx. Young guy, still young to this day, and about probably no more than 8 or 9 months into that role, maybe it was about a year into that role, Chris was thriving in that role, very strategic, very smart. He gets a weird call from none other than Elon Musk. And Elon says to him, I really need some help on the people front. It's not my strength. You can laugh now if you like. And I want you to come, he always gives people at Tesla, different titles than traditional titles. He said, I want you to come be the champion of the people here. And so he comes in and he goes, he wants me to come and talk to him. Should I go talk to him? And I said, well, Chris, when the richest man in the world, asks you to come talk to him, you don't have a whole lot to lose. Neither one of us is mercenaries. He had spent, at that point in time, 25 years at FedEx, but he went, and he became the CHRO at Tesla. After that. Now we're talking about a kid from North Memphis who both of his parents worked in the hub at FedEx when he was growing up. Managed to be the first one to make it through college, joined us as an intern, and now he's the CHRO at Tesla. Well, he ultimately, and fairly recently, he left Tesla and he's doing some really important civic work. And, that as you can imagine, that's a hard job, working directly for Elon in a company like that. But he did great work there. So let me go. That's the story of Chris. And that's why Chris is so important. But, Chris was another one of those people who our faith was something that we had in common. And I'll never forget one of the first things I told Chris when he was talking about making the move, when he was talking about heading over. I said, okay, Chris, let me explain something about the concept of grace to you. I'm a big believer, and I just have to be personal about this. I'm a big believer that God's grace is very important to us. And I said, grace is God's empowering presence, enabling you to be who he created you to be and do what he's called you to do. And so let me explain how this works. When you move into that calling, then you move into a graceful place. So gracefulness is that place where, you're getting that measure of grace, because God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So it's another part of humility. So when you move to that place where you are leading a graceful existence, then you've moved inside of that calling. But counter to that is a different place, and it's called disgrace. It's when that grace gets pulled back in a way that leaves you in a place that's very uncomfortable. And it's almost always possible for us as individuals to point at places along the journey where we maybe made the right decision and found ourselves in that graceful place, getting empowered to actually deliver the billing system nobody said was, but there's also those times when you maybe make a wrong decision and you find yourself in a place of disgrace. And that's when you have to go back and humble yourself and say, that's where I made the mistake. I'm going to go back and I'm going to connect again with a graceful future.
Such a short, simple question, but such an amazing perspective. So thank you for that, taking the time to share that. And, Rob, I think one of my favorite Robisms, I think, goes to, you and Chris and your leadership styles and philosophies. And thanks again to Chris. But I just want to read this. This is a Robism that gives me goosebumps every time I read it. And I quote you a lot on this when I do talks and so forth. But you say, to each of us, there comes in our lifetime that special moment when we are tapped on the shoulder and offered the chance to do a very special thing, unique to us and fitted to our talent. What a tragedy if that moment finds us unprepared or unwilling to do the work which would become our finest hour.
Well, it's obviously a little bit of a corruption of a Winston Churchill quote on finest hour, but it was one that I worked on for a long time, and I still have a couple of them left. But I had a bunch of plaques made. Actually, Dottie had them made for me so that I could give them to people at key moments in their careers when they were taking on a challenge that had every opportunity to be their finest hour. But it was also a reminder to say, look, the arc of your life and the arc of your influence and the arc of your career isn't going to be made up of easy things. Even if you're on a graceful path, you're going to find yourself in the quarry, working really hard where the chisel meets the stone, and it shapes you in ways that you just don't know, what you're even going to be facing. But finest hour is, it is about what a shame if we find ourselves unprepared or unwilling to do the work that would become our finest hour. I mean, that's the real linchpin. I mean, these opportunities, these taps on the shoulder do come along in all of our lives, but you got to be ready, and you got to be looking ahead going, this isn't going to be easy. That's not the point of this. This is going to be really hard, but it's an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to create an arc of your life that you can look back on and proud. You're never going to look back on the easiest times of your life and say that's what defined me. Eating peeled grapes, in Shangri-La. That's not it. It's when you shoulder the burden, someone else's burden, and the burden. And that's part of the hard work part of that mantra. Yes, it's hard work. Even in the midst of those times, though, you have to figure out ways to lead a balanced life. And all through that journey, you have to have an undying respect for people. But that's what that quote really means, is that, hard things are good for us. We're made, we are made to take on challenges. We're made to grow and learn through adversity and through strife and struggle at times in our life that really define each of us.
So powerful. I almost feel like there should be Rocky music playing in the background as I read it. It's just one of those very inspirational, and what a great time for us to pivot to our, tech for good and investing in future leaders, something that you're very passionate about. And today we've been very honored and blessed to be able to commit $350,000 of scholarships to STEM nonprofits. And you know how this works. We give you this ability to gift a seat in our 9-month leadership program, TechLX, to one of those great organizations that you are passionate about, that you support. So I know it's a hard call, but anybody come to mind, Rob, that you want to gift that to?
Well, there's an organization here in Memphis that I believe is really powerful, because there's something that I've recognized, and I didn't see this my whole life, but I've recognized it recently, and it's part of sort of a movement now that says, look, aptitude in society is evenly distributed, and you find aptitude in unusual places, but opportunity is not evenly distributed. Some of us are really blessed with the opportunity to go to college and chart a course for our life like what we described, and some people aren't. And the empathy that we all need to have for that is important. But the aptitude is so rich, and all you have to do is kind of go find it and unleash it. And so there's an organization here in Memphis called Code Crew. The CEO is a guy named Mecca Gwike, and Mecca does a great job of finding that aptitude and giving it opportunity, and letting individuals rise up and start new careers in technology and in coding, from a place where you wouldn't have imagined that they would come from. So I would love to nominate Mecca or whoever in his organization he thinks is the best to do that. He's the founder and CEO of Code Crew, but they come to mind just based on the way we're talking about it and based on stories like Chris.
What a great story. Yeah. So thank you to Mecca. We'll definitely connect with him and get Hay or one of his teammates to get plugged in. And this is game changing for folks because a lot of times these nonprofits, they don't have the opportunity, to make those kind of investments. So I'm excited about that. So Rob, I've taken a lot of your time. I know you're still busy with board work and all that, but I would love to run 3 rapid fire lightning round questions at you to kind of wrap it up. So these are quick, easy, fun. Well, maybe not, but anyways, the first one is, given where you sit today, the perspective you have, first thing that comes to mind to answer these 2 questions, knowing what I know now, one thing I would have been even more intentional about is, and one thing I'd be less concerned about is, as you think back on those early days in your career.
Yeah, so my general makeup is, kind of an amicable. I love people to like me. I want to be likable. And early in my career, I made some mistakes, thinking that was, as important as anything else. And a lot of times, and especially as you go into leadership positions, it's a military thing that I studied, but it's an important one. It's called commander's intent. And commander's intent is the ability to be clear, concise, and direct about what it is you need people to do. And early in my career, I don't think I was great at that. I think I got better at it. And it came through coaching. It came through some of those mentors. It came through Fred telling me I needed to be better at that. And, Fred fully understood commander's intent, because when you're in harm's way, in situations like what he and my father was a 3-war veteran, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And commander's intent is something that's absolutely critical so that people don't have confusion about what it is that's expected of them and what to do. So that's both, that's both bookends of that question. Be clear, concise, and direct about what it is you expect. You write it down so people can see it, and then back it up with accountability.
Yeah, so good. I always need to be better at that too. I appreciate that reminder. Rob, I know you read. I mean, you're a voracious reader. You read a variety of different things. So I'm going to put you on the spot here. Is there a book or 2 in your library that, as you think about CIOs today, that what's coming at them, what's going to be coming at them in the future? Is there a book or 2 they should be putting their nose into this weekend?
If okay with you, I'm even going to drill down to a chapter or 2 in a couple of books. And, that way it's less daunting for people to go maybe find it. So I'm a bit of a Glad fly. I'm a Malcolm Gladwell guy, but my favorite Gladwell book isn't everybody's favorite Gladwell book, and it's called Outliers. Outliers is an extraordinary book, and there's a chapter 10 in Outliers. It's called The Ethnic Theory of Plane Crashes. And I make all of my direct team and my officer team read chapter 10 of Outliers, because what it talks about is it talks about, these kind of thinly veiled notions, vague, it's the opposite of commander's intent. And he kind of unpacks, all of what happens in the midst of a plane crash. And it's usually just poor and veiled communication, way less direct. So, people need to be more direct when there's a lot at stake. And obviously, if a plane's getting ready to crash, there's a lot at stake. And you'd be shocked reading through this how veiled some of the communication was as a plane was, the black box records this stuff, and it, and the plane ends up making a crater or going into a mountain. And, and then you realize that, you can't, you have to be more direct about how you communicate. Another one is Peter Senge's Fifth Discipline. First couple chapters of Fifth Discipline really talk about shared mental models. And so one of the things, other than the ugly pictures that I talked about early in this was, okay, if not that, then what? And so shared mental models are really critical. And a lot of what we did to convince the business to move something better was we created these, visual conceptualizations of our systems model, of the things that we believed were the right thing for us to go do in the future. And so I would tell people to really embrace the idea of shared mental models. And and there's a part of this that is something that Senge calls the right column dialogue in those first couple of chapters. And the right column is what people don't say that they should. So it ties right back into Gladwell's book. If you're veiling the message, or if you're just not saying it at all, even though you need to say it, then you're making a mistake. Try and draw those things out. So I would point to those. But the joy, one of the joys of my life right now is I'm getting to read novels. I just finished Shogun, a couple of weeks ago, and what a treat that was to read that epic, 1,600 page, beast. I read another. So that was Clavel's book, Shogun. The TV show is what made me, want to go back and read it again. But I also read something called Covenant of Water, which is a really interesting story about India and Kerala in particular, the southwestern coast of India, and written by a guy named Abraham Verghese. And novels that are all accurate with their historical context, and you learn something about history, even though the characters are fictional. So, take a little time. I regret now maybe not reading more novels as I was active. I have time to do that now. What a treat it is to be able to do that. But I regret maybe not reading a few more things like that when I was on active duty. Let's call it that way.
Right. Well, I'm going to go and check those out. Thank you for that. And, you've been incredibly disciplined with the journey. You've chart the course for what's next, but you're still a young guy and you're the GOAT. So, here's probably the hardest question of the day is what's next for Rob Carter? What's this next chapter going to be for you? Because I think it's going to be, what is it? Your finest hour, Rob. Hard to imagine.
So I'm not that young. I turned 65 and, retired kind of right at the mark. It was a plan. Like you said, I'm a little disciplined and, had a plan and executed to it. And, really, really thrilled with that. But, there's another one of those faith things. It's, where we're told to, teach us to number our days, O Lord, so that we might gain a heart of wisdom. That doesn't necessarily mean make each day count. That makes what that means is help us understand that our days are numbered. That we don't have infinite days in this part of life. We have to get a heart of wisdom about how to spend time. And so in my journey here, and I credit this quote to Mike Glenn, he said, the first half of your life needs to be about success, but the second half of it needs to shift to significance. And so I'm doing, more work that I hope is significant. Everything from the fact that my 8th grandchild was just born last week. And so I have grandkids and 5 kids and, a beautiful wife who deserves more of my time and energy. As we, move into, those golden years, but, maybe a great friend of mine, who is also a colleague said, this is how it works. He said, you got your go-go years and you got your slow-go years and you got your no-go years. And he said, you don't really want to spend all of your go-go years up at work. You want to have some go-go years left, and then you can move into the slow-go years, but don't just retire when you get to your no-go years. And granted, health is one of those mysteries that, can affect us all differently at different times in our life. But I'm fortunate enough still have my health and energy to enjoy some of those go-go years. But I do love board service. I've got great boards that I work on, both civic and for profit, and a wonderful family that balances me, keeps me humble. They don't buy into this goat thing at all. It's just dad. He's like, Dad, come on. But I think they're proud. I think they're proud of their old man, and it's good to have that feeling too. But it's also good to have people who keep you humble.
For sure. Well, I hope you'll share this podcast with them. I think they'll learn some things about dad and grandpa, and this was just so special. I mean, I just thanks so much for letting me unpack so much of this GOAT journey. I know that makes you uncomfortable, but I think people can appreciate that now. And I think it's one of those that people will listen to over and over again. So thank you for that. And again, I just wish you this next chapter. I know it's going to be more go for you, and it's going to be pretty special. And just thanks for being so amazing for us in our industry, Rob.
Well, what a treat, Dan. Thank you for the hard work getting those mystery questioners. And, I can't tell you how much I appreciate the opportunity to share. You can tell I kind of enjoy sharing, these stories in life, and hope that in some way people find them valuable. But thank you very much for the great work that you do.
Well, there you have it, everybody. Now you know why I call him the GOAT, the greatest of all time. And I certainly couldn't have done this justice without the help of the mystery questioners, who all consider themselves blessed to have worked side by side with Rob for decades, which is just incredible. I hope you're as inspired as I am, inspired to take our leadership game to the next level, inspired to help those that we lead, to help them thrive and write their next chapter in what I think is an incredible profession. So I'm excited to spend more time with Rob. As you know, we're going to craft an article on CIO.com that highlights more of Rob's leadership superpowers and really gets into those things that really matter. You get a little sneak peek in the podcast, and we're going to go deeper into this in the article. So with that, I'll leave it there. Thanks for joining, and please share this with all your friends. Stay well.
You've been listening to Tech Whisperers, inside the playbook of the best digital leaders, a G.O.A.T and Associates podcast. Keep connected with us by subscribing to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you like what you've heard, please rate the show, as this helps us connect the world's best digital leaders with those who aspire to learn, grow, and thrive in this amazing profession. Thanks for listening. Until next time.